Okay. All right. So yeah, so look, forgive me for all these troubles, but it's the best I can do in these trying circumstances. Okay, and let me see here. Tell me if the audio is okay. Can you, is buffering again, somebody says? Okay, we're just going to have to live with whatever we got with the buffering. Is the audio buffering? How is the audio? Is the audio okay? First it said it was having an excellent connection. And then it says it's having a poor connection. Gosh, I mean, it said it was excellent. And then it says it's poor. So, yeah. Okay. So let me ask, this is, can you at least hear me? I know, why am I in the wilderness? I'm going to explain why I'm in the wilderness. Okay? I can hear you and see you. Audio is good. I can hear you. Okay, so look, I'm going to... Okay, I'm just going to begin. And I'm going to hope for the best. This is a Starlink and I'm in the middle of the wilderness. Okay, just go ahead and send it. That's what I'm going to do, okay? All right, so let me explain. Let me make sure the thing is recording. Yes, it's recording, so the edited version will actually turn out okay. Let me explain what this is. We're trying to do a lot of live streams this week, like for the next 5 days. And we're needing to use this Starlink thing to do it. And yeah, so people are saying the picture and the audio looks good. Anyway, so I'll explain all of this in the actual talk, okay? So if you're actually saying that you can hear me, then I am just going to begin, okay? Okay. Boy, this YouTube interface is really sort of messed up also. All right, okay. Okay, it's good enough. Okay, here we go, everybody. Anyway, so I will be messing around with this Starlink thing during the week, trying to improve it. But in the meantime, let's just begin, okay? So this week, I will be speaking to you from the wilderness, both literally and figuratively. I have taken my camper and driven into the wilderness, near a beach where I like to surf, meet with extraterrestrials in hidden locations in the middle of the night, make video recordings of ET spacecraft, and in general, immerse myself in otherworldly activities and environments. I'm surrounded by ruins, pristine nature, with the dominant element being contrasts. And indeed, I have to say that this level of striking contrast is appropriate for the time period that we're all entering now on this planet. So this is a period where we are all entering the wilderness. Seriously. Now, my internet access is limited, but it's supposed to be okay with Starlink. We'll see how it goes. My cell phone service comes and goes, and I'm connected to you now via Starlink, my Starlink terminal. And this is my first time to actually try to use it. So the situation is simple. A camper in the wilderness, a small satellite dish pointing into the sky, a camera recording those thoughts while the waves roll in and out along the shore, and a world that's literally falling apart. So that's the setting. Now the location where I am is more than just a backdrop. It's symbolic. And in many ways, humanity itself is entering a wilderness. Now, civilizations, let me say it, that civilizations rarely collapse in the way that people imagine. Movies often portray collapse as a sudden explosion of chaos, a dramatic movement when everything falls apart all at once. But in reality, the process is usually quieter and more gradual. Institutions that once seemed permanent begin to lose their authority, and political structures become unstable. Economic systems begin to strain under the pressures that had been building for years, sometimes decades, and that's where we are now. Now, at first, the changes appear manageable, and that's why people are still trying to manage things politically and everything, but then suddenly they accelerate, and we're right in the middle of the acceleration stage. So one day, people realize that the world that they assumed would always exist no longer is functioning the way it once did. Well, friends, writers and historians have described this process in many different ways. And one of the most famous literary explorations of civilization collapse, which is honestly where we are now, it's the beginning of that, appears in the novel Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. Now, Achebe was writing about the collision between traditional African societies and European colonial power. But the story shows how an entire cultural system, something that had existed for generations, could unravel when confronted with forces that its leaders did not fully understand. So the phrase, things fall apart, has since become a shorthand for the experience of watching a familiar world lose its structure. And that's where we are now. But collapse is rarely the whole story. When systems fall apart, something else begins to emerge. New arrangements of power take shape, new institutions arise, and new forms of social organization replace the old one. Now, the period between the collapse of one system and the stabilization of another is often confusing, and to be quite honest, it's dangerous. And it's going to become, on this planet, very dangerous. It's a time when the rules that people once relied on no longer function, and the new rules have not yet been written. So that period is what I am calling the wilderness. And we are entering the wilderness. Now, the wilderness is not simply a place on the map, although I am on a place on the map in the wilderness, but it's a phrase in the life of a civilization. It's a phrase that describes a phase in the life of a civilization. And interestingly, some of the clearest descriptions of what such a wilderness might look like have come not from historians or political scientists, but from writers of science fiction. So if we really want to get a good idea of where we are on this planet and where we're heading, we really can't look at academics. We have to look at people who think in the future, who imagine things and can understand where we're going based on their own imagination. That's where we get the best ideas of where we are and where we're going. So one particularly striking example appears in the novel named Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson. Now, this was written in the 1990s, long before the rise of modern social media. Now, the novel describes a future in which traditional national governments have largely lost their authority. And in Stephenson's world of Snow Crash, society has fragmented into a patchwork of private territories, corporate enclaves, and loosely connected communities. And that's what's going to happen here. Public institutions that once defined the political order have weakened or disappeared, and they're replaced by networks of private power and technological systems that operate outside the traditional framework of the state. So Stephenson was not attempting to predict the future in any precise sense. Science fiction rarely works that way. Rather, what was happening is what he was doing instead was exploring a set of structural pressures, technological change, institutional decay, and the growing importance of information itself as a tool of power. So here we are more than 30 years later, and some of those pressures look surprisingly familiar. And that is why Snow Crash provides an interesting lens through which to think about the historical moment that humanity is in now, that we're entering. Because if we look carefully at the world around us today, we can begin to see the outlines of a similar wilderness beginning to take shape. And we not only are looking at this by looking at the news, but we're looking at our remote viewing results at Farsight to get an idea of where we're going and how to map this out. So I'm going to be getting to the Farsight stuff in a little bit, but first let me sort of flesh out the Stephenson idea. So to understand why this novel is relevant today, it helps to understand the world that Stephenson imagined, and then you can see how it's similar to what we're entering. Now, the story takes place in a future version of the United States, in which traditional authority of government has largely evaporated. So the nation is still technically there, it still exists, but its power has withered. Public institutions have been replaced by a complex web of private organizations, corporate territories, franchise city-states, and gated communities. And so what once were public functions, policing, security, infrastructure, and even citizenship, they've been privatized and fragmented. So the main character of the story, Snow Crash, has one of the most memorable names in modern science fiction. He's Hero Protagonist. Now, Hero is a hacker, computer hacker, and a swordsman. And he lives in a tiny storage unit and works as a pizza delivery driver for a powerful corporate organization known as the Mafia. And that's significant. In Stephenson's imagined future, the Mafia has transformed itself into a large corporate enterprise that runs restaurants, delivery networks, and security operations. And in fact, that is not too distant from what actually happens in our own societies. Very often when a new country takes over, the security people are actually co-opted or brought into the government from organized crime, because the security people need to know how to use guns, they have to know how to use force, they have to know how to enforce things, and organized crime, the criminals, they actually know how to do it. So the governments of newly formed countries actually sometimes go to the cartels, the organized criminals, and make a deal with them, saying basically, we'll let you be legitimate, but you got to come over to our side and organize things. And that's how a lot of times within government you get entrenched corruption, because the people that are brought in, had sort of a background. So in fact, in many traditional organizations in this world, they've evolved into legitimate businesses. So criminal organizations very often evolve into legitimate businesses that operate alongside other entities. So this is not uncommon. So at the beginning of the novel, Snow Crash, Hero navigates two parallel worlds. Now the first is the physical world. That's a fragmented landscape of privatized neighborhoods and corporate territories where law and order are maintained by whichever organization controls the land. Now the second is a vast shared virtual environment known as the metaverse. And people put headsets on to go into it, things like that. Now it's a digital universe where people appear as avatars, and they interact through immersive computer networks. So long before the modern discussions of virtual reality platforms and digital worlds, Stephenson imagined a fully realized online environment where identity, commerce, and social interaction unfold in real time. So Snow Crash was one of the novels that really helped create the genre of cyberpunk. So A Neuromancer by William Gibson was the other novel. Those two novels really did it. So in Snow Crash, back to Snow Crash here, Hero, the protagonist, he spends much of his life moving between these two realities, the virtual reality and the reality of physical life, which is him as a pizza person, pizza delivery man. So the plot begins to unfold when a mysterious digital drug begins circulating through the metaverse. Now, this substance is known as Snow Crash, which is the name of the novel. Now, at first glance, it appears to be simply a computer virus, and it can crash the minds of hackers and programmers when they encounter it in the virtual world with the headset and so on. But as the story develops, it becomes clear that Snow Crash is something much more profound and dangerous. Stephenson introduces a startling idea that human language itself may operate like a form of programming code. And drawing on ancient mythology and linguistic theory, the novel suggests that early human civilizations once possessed a powerful universal language that could influence the brain directly. Now, according to the story, this language functioned almost like a neurological operating system for humanity. And over time, that ancient linguistic system fragmented into many languages that we know today. But here's the thing. The Snow Crash virus represents an attempt to reconstruct and weaponize that original programming language. So instead of simply infecting computers, it can infect the human mind itself also. And individuals who encounter it may become susceptible to external control. Their cognitive autonomy is weakened or even overridden completely by those who understand how to manipulate the underlying code. Now, believe it or not, this actually can happen. And Stephenson goes into how this type of virus in the body can be transmitted by blood, but it can also be transmitted by religions and ideologies and factions. But it's a programming inside the head. So as the novel progresses, Hero begins to investigate the origins of this virus. His search leads him into a complicated conspiracy involving corporate powers, powerful religious movements, and an ambitious effort to use language, media, and digital networks to control large populations of the people. You can see that happening already today, where the media, the masses are influenced and led by the media, and there is no area that you can actually turn to where somebody isn't trying to control you by feeding you certain information. So in the novel, along the way, hero protagonist is joined by a great character, a teenage courier named YT, for yours truly. And she is a skateboard riding messenger who moves through the chaotic infrastructure of this fragmented society, delivering information in packages between different territories. Together, hero protagonist and YT, for yours truly, they navigate a world where power no longer resides primarily in governments, but in those who control networks, economic networks, technological networks, and above all, information networks. The central struggle of the novel ultimately revolves around whether the Snow Crash system can be used to dominate human consciousness on a massive scale, or whether individuals will retain the ability to think and act independently. And in other words, the story is not merely about technology, it's about who controls the operating system of civilization itself. Friends, the key features of the Snow Crash world is understood this way. Once the story is understood, several structural themes become clear. And these themes are the reason the novel remains so interesting even today. First, the authority of the traditional nation state has weakened dramatically. Governments still exist in name, but they no longer dominate the political landscape. Instead, power is dispersed across a wide range of private entities, corporations, franchise territories, security organizations, and loosely organized communities. Second, public services have been privatized. Infrastructure, policing, and social order, they're maintained not by centralized institutions like the government, by whichever organization controls a particular territory. And society becomes a patchwork of semi-autonomous zones, each operating, well, according to its own rules. So there's nothing sort of universal. Well, third, information becomes the most powerful strategic resource. Control over communication networks, media systems, digital environments allows certain actors to shape the perceptions and behaviors of large populations. Again, we have the same situation of the few trying to control the many. Now, fourth, technology continues to advance even as political institutions weaken. So the metaverse remains highly sophisticated. Digital communication flourishes, but the system that once organized collective decision-making, those systems are far less stable. And friends, my argument here is that's where we're heading. And finally, in Snow Crash, the battle for power increasingly takes place inside the human mind itself. Language, narratives, media, and symbolic systems become tools that can influence how people think and what they believe to be real. So let's talk about why this matters today, right now. Neil Stephenson was not writing a prophecy. Science fiction authors rarely attempt to predict the future with precision, but what they often do instead is to identify the underlying pressures when a civilization then, and once they have those pressures, then they imagine how those pressures might reshape society if they continue to intensify. So the pressures that Stephenson explored in Snow Crash include the erosion of centralized authority, the growing dominance of technological networks, and the possibility that the information itself could become the most powerful instrument of control, the information. So more than 3 decades later, here we are. Many of the pressures have not disappeared that we see today. If anything, they've accelerated. And this raises the interesting question, are we beginning to see the early stages of the kind of wilderness that Stephenson imagined? Okay, well, let's talk about points of convergence. When a science fiction novel remains influential for decades, it is usually not because it predicted the future in detail. No. Rather, it's because the author managed to identify certain structural pressures within society and to explore where those pressures might lead if they continued to intensify. So, seen from that perspective, several elements of the world depicted in Snow Crash really do seem strikingly familiar. Now let me pause for a second and say that in our government, in our current time period, these are things that sort of have happened that parallel what happened in Stephenson's fictional future. So we already have that the national governments their authority is eroding dramatically. They don't dominate the landscape any longer. They're there, but they are powerless. If you look at Europe, some of those governments can't do anything. They can't even control their own populations. So the power is migrating often into private organizations, technological organizations, networks, things like that. So when you look at the governments, it's very difficult to ignore the instability of many political systems around the world right now. They once appeared to be permanent, but now they're facing declining legitimacy. And political polarization has intensified. Look in the United States, you get the level of political polarization that's right off the scale. It's very possible that this country, the United States, may break up in the next few years. This is not me talking, this is some military generals have actually worried about things like that. And in many countries, trust in the political institutions has eroded to historic low levels. So when the institutions lose their legitimacy, they do not necessarily disappear immediately, but their ability to organize and stabilize society weakens. Look at the U.S. Congress. The U.S. Congress is one of the most corrupt organizations anywhere. I mean, it's been bought and sold. It's money controls the whole thing. And very few people have any trust in the United States Congress, but it's still there. So it really has lost its ability to organize and stabilize society. That element has weakened. And that process is often one of the earliest signs that the civilization is entering a wilderness phase. Now, a second thing that you can draw from Snow Crash is the fragmentation idea. So the world of Snow Crash is really highly fragmented. So there are no unified political systems. Society has broken up into territories, corporate zones, communities that are private, loosely connected enclaves. So increasingly, we can excuse me, we can see hints of similar fragmentation appearing in the modern world. Right now, in our world, economic inequality has created environments in which different groups live dramatically different lives, completely different realities. And digital communication has allowed people to cluster into self-reinforcing communities that share common beliefs, but they rarely interact with those outside of the networks. Even geographically, many cities are becoming collections of distinct cultural and economic islands rather than unified civic environments. So fragmentation doesn't necessarily mean an immediate collapse, but it does mean that the shared frameworks that once held societies together begin to weaken. And that's what we're seeing. And then let's talk about the idea of information as a weapon, because that's a key element in Snow Crash that we're seeing here in our society. One of the most important ideas in Snow Crash is that language and information can function as tools of power. So in the novel, the Snow Crash virus is essentially a form of a weaponized information. It's a form of weaponized information that's capable of altering human cognition. So while the mechanisms in Stephenson's story are fictional, the underlying insight that information can shape and manipulate human perception, that has become one of the defining characteristics of the modern era. Today, vast communication networks allow ideas, narratives, and emotional signals to spread across the planet almost instantly. Media systems, algorithmic platforms, and information campaigns increasingly influence how people interpret events and understand reality itself. So the struggle for influence is no longer confined to territory or resources. It increasingly takes place in the arena of perception and belief. And then there's technological acceleration that happens within the institutional instability. So inside Stephenson's fictional world is that technological progress continues even as the political institutions weaken. So you can even think of AI as like this. The technology is going to keep on growing. The institutions are going to weaken as we enter further into the wilderness. And then you're going to see new groups taking advantage of the new technology to sideline the older institutions, the governmental institutions. So in many ways, this dynamic is very visible today. Technological systems are advancing at extraordinary speed. You have artificial intelligence, you have digital communication networks, you have automated infrastructure, and global data systems. Yet the institutions responsible for regulating or guiding these technologies, they often struggle to keep pace, or they just flounder. So the result can be a strange paradox. You get a society that is simultaneously more technologically powerful and politically unstable at the same time. And now let's turn to the idea of the battle for what's in your head, the human mind. So perhaps the most profound idea explored in Snow Crash is that the ultimate battleground for power may lie inside the human mind itself. So Stephenson imagines a world in which linguistic and symbolic systems can directly influence human cognition. So while his narrative takes this concept into speculative territory, the broader insight remains relevant today. Whoever shapes the stories people believe can exert enormous influence over how societies evolve. So the fight is to control what you believe. Narratives, symbols, media frameworks, and ideological systems, they all compete to define reality for large populations, alone or in combination. These things can literally act as viruses that fundamentally structure the very nature of thinking. These are viruses of cognition. They are infection viruses that spread, they dominate, and they conquer. And the outcome of these struggles can shape political decisions, cultural identities, and historical trajectories. So let's talk about the emerging wilderness. Taken individually, none of these developments that I've just talked about necessarily indicates that civilization is collapsing right now. Societies have always evolved through periods of tension and transformation. But friends, when several of these pressures appear simultaneously, you get the weakening institutions, the social fragmentation, the intensified information warfare, and rapid technological change, and deep struggles over perception and belief. The result can be a period of profound uncertainty. And such periods are historically rare, but they are not unprecedented. They are the moments when civilizations leave behind the stability of an established order and begin moving into new and largely uncharted landscapes. In other words, they are entering the wilderness. Friends, I want to make this more concrete by giving an example. So, these days it's common for people to say that social media is killing society. I have heard so many authorities claim that people are retreating into social media as a means of escaping from the problems inherent with interacting with real people. For example, dating among young people has collapsed all over the world, not just in one country. It just does not seem to happen like it used to happen. Now, personally, when I was in my 20s and 30s, honestly, most of my free thinking time was dedicated to how to find a girlfriend and have sex with her. And nearly all of my age mates seemed to think similarly. We all compared notes on how we made love and what women like to hear and do. But that simply does not happen any longer. Now, I know that you're thinking that I'm going off topic, but I'm not. Hang in there with me, and I will show you the connection. Let me tell you something that happened. This is true. It's a real thing. One evening in Africa, I was sitting with my friends on the low-level wall that surrounded the post office in Mombasa. It was about a meter and a half tall, and it surrounded the post office, and we all used to sit there in the evenings. And the typical evening routine was that we would go out to eat something, and then we'd gather around the wall, or at the wall, sitting on the wall. So there we were. There were about 100 of us, and we were sitting on the wall. It's like the way you see birds sitting on a row on a power line. I assume everyone has seen large groups of birds sitting on such power lines. So you know what it was like on the wall surrounding the Mombasa post office. 1 second. There was a bug flying into my eye, so I had to make sure I got rid of it. Okay. Now, most of us on the wall around the Mombasa post office were of similar youthful age. But on the far end of the line, sort of near the intersection there were two elderly men. Well, not elderly men, they were elders. But they were not like old, but they were elders. And they seemed to be a psychological grounding element to the group of 100 younger guys. So in Swahili, they are called the wazee, which means the wise elders of the group. And they sat there pretty much almost every night, and they gave us all solid advice night after night. We all used to love to listen to them. Well, there was one fellow, my age, who just got a new girlfriend. And he was really upset. I mean, terribly upset. He was certain that this woman was the woman of his dreams that he wanted to marry. But the previous night, he tried to make love with her, and he got an erection, but according to him, it would not go in. That's his exact words in Swahili, but still, it would not go in. Try though he did, and he tried and tried. He said he pushed and pushed, and it did not work. It did not go in, according to him. Finally, he gave up. But he said that the woman was willing and even eager, but he failed, and he did not know what to do or what he did. His manhood was like terribly challenged. Well, the two wise elders listened patiently to his entire story. And after my friend finished, with his eyes cast down to the ground, the two wise elders spoke. Everything was in Swahili, but I will tell you what was said. The two elders expressed how they were totally disgusted with how the young men of these days are not taught anything. They're absolutely idiots, they said. They worried about the fate of the world with such young men running around it and running the world. And one of the elders even spit on the ground in disgust. And my friend, he was clearly feeling worse and worse. And then one of the two elders spoke the truth. He again complained about how poorly educated the younger generation is, and then he said it bluntly. He said with a loud voice that the people around him could hear. And again, if you allow me to translate it into English, he said, "You idiot, you needed to brush it. Brush it. You don't just poke it in, you brush it." That's what he said. And then my young friend's eyes, they opened up wider than I have ever seen them. And I knew this guy well. And he said, "Brush it. Of course. I needed to brush it." Again, the two elders, they voiced their disgust at the younger generation. And, well, although sitting really close to the wise elders, they saw my friend exclaim about how he now understands that he needed to brush it. And they all started to laugh. Well, my friend kept on remarking over and over again, "Brush it, of course, I needed to brush it." Well, back to the image of the long string of birds on the power line. Each person in the line at the post office wall, starting with those that were closest to the elders, asked the person next to him, "What is all the commotion about?" And the person closer to the wise elders said that my young friend did not know that he had to brush it. Well, then each person told the person next to him what had happened, like a row of dominoes falling one after another. And in about 30 seconds, the cascade of bobbing heads was complete, and the entire line of 100 of my friends were all bobbing their heads up and down, seemingly in unison, as they chuckled at how dumb my friend was that he did not know that he needed to brush it. They were all 100 of them, they were all bobbing. And so If you can imagine 100 guys in a row sitting on the wall of the post office, all bobbing their heads up and down for seemingly maybe 10 or 15 minutes, you can get an idea of how this went. Now, through it all, through the entire thing, my young friend kept exclaiming, "Of course, I forgot to brush it, of course," which only made everyone laugh harder because they were all looking at him and how he was exclaiming that. Okay, now, what does this say about the collapse of civilization on this planet as humanity enters the wilderness? I'm going to connect it. It is obvious. It starts with the observation that a person can be in distress and simply not know what is the cause of the distress. The person can blame all sorts of things while grasping for any idea that might explain a failure, however perceived. Now, my friend, he thought his situation was a personal failure, but when civilization collapses, everyone will think that there must have been something that they did wrong. When civilization enters the wilderness, the first response of the masses is panic and depression, and nothing can help those who are caught up with such an internal battle except knowledge. Knowledge that must come from an outside source that is respected, like the elders. That is just as my friend, let me say it that is just as my friend could not understand or solve his problem by himself inside his own head, neither can the masses solve their problem of a civilization that is torn with war, scandal, and collapse by just thinking about it. The masses cannot find their way out of this mental mess that captures them when their world collapses. But at this delicate moment, right now, the moment of desperation when one seeks anything from any reliable source to explain what is happening, at that deep moment, the masses are open to suggestion. And that is the moment when the pivot can happen. That's the moment when new information can be given that reorients them to a new way of thinking. And until that moment occurs, they will remain resistant to new information completely. They're going to reject it. But at that delicate moment of despair, of hopelessness, they will open their cognition to new ideas, and they can finally see the truth. Finally. They need to enter the wilderness for this to happen. So the wilderness is not a bad thing, it's a good thing. Only then will they find their way to a new understanding, a new path. And only then does the wilderness transform into structure. A new structure that is clearly different from their failed past civilization structure. So let's talk about the moment of recognition. For many years, discussions about civilization instability were treated largely as theoretical exercises. Scholars, historians, writers of speculative fiction, they often explored scenarios in which political systems might weaken or social orders might fragment. But these discussions were usually framed as possibilities that might occur at some distant point in the future. Today, that distance is disappearing. Across the world, events are unfolding with a speed and intensity that would have seemed improbable only a decade ago. Political systems that once appeared stable now face mounting internal pressures. Now, we have known about this at Farsight, especially with our deep news projects, for a very long time. But we had to wait because the deep news projects allowed us to see what was coming, but we had to wait till it actually happened. And now we're seeing what's coming. Now it's manifesting. So alliances that shaped the global order for generations, right now, they're being tested. Like NATO. What's NATO? People are asking that. Conflicts that had been contained for years are beginning to expand outward, drawing larger powers into increasingly dangerous confrontations. Now with the things going on with the Iran war with Israel and the United States, other powers are drawing in. Russia's joining in, China's joining in. things are happening, and these are very dangerous confrontations. So for most people, these developments still appear as isolated news stories, individual crises that seem unrelated to one another. And a lot of people are saying, well, it hasn't really affected, say, for example, here in the United States. But a conflict in one region and an economic shock in another, a technological disruption somewhere else, viewed separately, each event appears manageable, even temporary. But when these developments are viewed together, a different picture begins to emerge. So what we are witnessing may not simply be a collection of independent crises. We are helped greatly by the Farsight remote viewing projects. So what I am arguing is that we are witnessing the early stages of a systemic transition, because with the Farsight projects that you can all see on farsightprime.com, we not only see the stuff that you're seeing now manifest, but we see what happens after that. Friends, civilizations rarely announce the moment when they begin to transform. There is no single day when historians can point to a calendar and say, this was the exact moment when the old world ended. It doesn't work like that. Instead, there is usually a gradual shift in the underlying structure of events. Patterns begin to change, assumptions that once seemed reliable stopped working, political decisions that once stabilized the system begin producing unintended consequences. So for a long time, most people continue to believe that the disruptions are temporary, and eventually a moment of recognition arrives when people begin to sense that the familiar frameworks organizing their lives are no longer holding together. The institutions that once coordinated global systems struggle to maintain control. The information environments become increasingly chaotic, and the political decisions, they grow more volatile. The pace of technological change accelerates beyond the ability of the traditional institutions to manage it. Now, at first, the recognition spreads slowly. You can, for example, watch YouTube videos where some scholars are talking about this, but those are the scholars talking about it. They're recognizing it, but it's just slowly spreading into the masses. But then, eventually, suddenly, it spreads, and it spreads quickly. The masses, it's like a wildfire. And when that recognition begins to take hold across large populations, history often enters one of its most unpredictable phases. We know this by looking historically at what has happened in societies. It's at this point that societies begin to understand that they are no longer living within the stability of the old order. They have entered the wilderness. And the wilderness is not merely a metaphor for collapse. It's a condition of uncertainty. The old structures of authority weaken, but the new structures have not yet emerged. The rules that once governed the political behavior become unreliable, and the narratives that once unified populations, they lose their persuasive power. And the competition to define the future intensifies dramatically. Historically, these wilderness periods have often been both dangerous and creative. They are moments when civilizations face profound risks, but they are also moments when entirely new forms of organization can emerge. That's the upside. The outcome is never predetermined, but one thing is usually clear. Once such a transition begins, the world that existed before it will not return. And that is the recognition that humanity is now beginning to confront right now. Now, friends, interestingly, physics, believe it or not, real physics, it hints at something similar. Physics hints at something similar. There was an American physicist named Rolf Landauer, and he figured out that information is actually energy. And this was later confirmed in experiments that were conducted around 2012. So I'm going to skip the technical details, but the basic idea is that information is not just stuff that is organized. It's real. And since Einstein tells us that energy equals mass times the speed of light squared, energy is mass. And that means organization, which is information, is energy. And therefore, it's tied to mass. Now, this is important because when we do remote viewing, we're transferring information across time and space. Think about this. If information is also energy and equivalent to mass, E equals mc squared, we are, with our minds, transferring energy and mass across time and space. And it's only a matter of time before our technological understanding matches that of the ETs, and that's how the ships fly across the galaxy in unbelievable speeds and get here. Information can travel across time and space, past, present, and future. And that means real stuff can travel across time and space, past, present, and future. Well, the experiment that confirmed that this actually existed was to create a completely closed system where nothing could get in or out. No energy, no mass. And so this experiment was done around 2012 to prove that Landauer was correct. And the system was totally closed to the outside world. But something inside the system is organized. Think of things being lined up or some other kind of organization. And over time, the organization decays, perhaps due to entropy. Things sort of just drift apart. And the experiment confirmed Landauer's prediction that when the organization decayed, energy expressed as heat was actually released. And they could measure the heat. It was uncanny, but it's true. And it's not in dispute. This is a known aspect of physics. And they actually measured it. So when information, which is simply the organization of stuff in the system, decays, things random started happening, they were releasing energy and they measured it. And Landauer framed this as the erasure of information or organization, but it's the same as the decay of information. Well, let's talk about a society now. When a society enters the wilderness, the organization that dominated the previous structure of that society is erased. Remember, in the words of Chinua Achebe, things fall apart. So in a very real sense, when any previously established structure collapses, real stuff is destroyed, measurable stuff. The structure that held the society together collapses and energy is released. In our discussion here, that energy is experienced as the trauma felt when one walks into the wilderness for the first time. Not because one is seeking a vacation, but because the structure behind you collapsed and you were forced into the wilderness. But we all seek structure. We all want something to ground our experience. We don't like living in realms where there's no structure. So once we are in the wilderness, we seek to establish structure again, but this time a new type of structure. And when we do this, we are using real energy to create that new structure. And that is why the new structure feels real. It is real in a physics sense. So let's talk about thinking clearly when we're in the wilderness, because that's where we're going. When civilizations enter the wilderness periods, the greatest danger is not always physical conflict or economic instability. The greatest danger is confusion. For generations, people become accustomed to living within systems that explain reality for them. The governments provide official narratives. The media institutions frame events in ways that appear coherent. Educational systems reinforce the assumptions that define the boundaries of acceptable thought. Well, these structures create the comforting impression that the world is understandable and predictable. During the wilderness periods, those interpretive frameworks begin to fracture. the events start moving faster than the institutions responsible for explaining them. And the narratives that once seemed authoritative, they begin to contradict one another. And you see that happening when you look at the news. One person says one thing's happening, the other person says another thing's happening. Large populations find themselves navigating a flood of information without a stable map that tells them what is true and what is not true. So in such an environment, what you're going to see is the first task is not physical survival. The first task is like, what the heck's going on? It's clarity of perception. The ability to observe events carefully, to question narratives that demand blind acceptance, and to resist the emotional contagion that often spreads during times of crisis becomes enormously important. Friends, the wilderness periods reward those who can remain calm enough to analyze patterns, while others are reacting impulsively to rapidly changing circumstances. In other words, the wilderness is not only a physical environment, it's also an information environment. And navigating that environment requires a particular mindset. So let's connect this to the idea of the independence of thought. So one of the most important characteristics of wilderness periods is that centralized authorities often struggle to maintain informational control. As compelling narratives, as competing narratives emerge, the populations are exposed to multiple explanations for the same events. Somebody will say, this is what's going on, and someone will say, no, it's this instead. And so some of these explanations will be attempts to manipulate perception. They'll be wanting to say, look at this in this way, and this is how to interpret it. And others will simply reflect the confusion among the institutions that no longer fully understand the systems that they once managed. You'll get chaos and mess, the whole thing. So under these conditions, individuals like you and me, must develop a greater capacity for independent thinking. Accepting the first explanation offered by an authority figure or a media outlet becomes increasingly risky when the institutions themselves are struggling to interpret events accurately. So this does not mean rejecting all information. It means learning how to evaluate information critically. That's what needs to be done. So let's connect this now to the awareness of the narrative warfare, because that's what we're heading into. Narrative warfare. The modern world is saturated with narratives that are competing for influence over human perception. Governments, corporations, ideological movements, religions, and media systems, they all attempt to shape how populations interpret reality. Now, in stable periods of history, these narratives often reinforce one another, producing a relatively coherent public understanding of events. But during the wilderness periods, which we are entering as a whole planet right now, the narrative systems begin to conflict openly, and that's what you're seeing. Competing actors attempt to define reality in ways that serve their strategic interests, recognizing this environment as a battle for perception. And now, actually, recognizing that this environment is a battle for perception is absolutely essential for maintaining intellectual autonomy. That's what we have to have. So this points at the value of knowledge. Communities, when large systems become unstable, smaller networks of cooperation often become really important. And those smaller communities are the key. Historically, if we look in history and learn from history, wilderness periods often have produced communities that are dedicated to preserving knowledge, exchanging information, and helping individuals understand complex events that larger institutions can no longer explain effectively. Now, these communities and in the old days, sometimes those communities were involved in writing, transcribing, translating books and other things, even things that came off of tablets, in order to try to solidify this perceptual information. These communities can take many forms. In the current time period, they can take forms of like scientific networks, intellectual circles, cultural groups, or research organizations devoted to exploring questions that mainstream institutions are unwilling or unable to address, and that includes Farsight and those of you who follow Farsight. Now, sometimes key communities form around internet circles, such as like Telegram channels. In times of uncertainty, such networks can become valuable sources of insight and stability. So, let's now pivot and talk about psychological stability. So finally, wilderness periods demand a certain psychological discipline. Periods of systemic transition can generate intense anxiety. Rapid changes in political and economic systems often produce emotional reactions that make careful analysis very difficult. Fear spreads quickly when populations believe that the future is unpredictable. Maintaining psychological stability in such environments is therefore not a trivial skill. It's hard. And it allows individuals to observe events with greater clarity, making thoughtful decisions, and to avoid becoming swept into waves of panic or ideological extremism. So it's very valuable to be able to do this. So in a sense, wilderness periods reward the same qualities that have always allowed humans to survive in unfamiliar environments. Patience, observation, cooperation, and the ability to adapt when old assumptions no longer apply. So let's talk about learning to navigate the wilderness, since that's where we're heading. We're entering the wilderness on this planet. Civilizations have passed through wilderness periods before, so we can learn from them. The collapse of older systems has often been followed by the emergence of new cultural, political, and technological structures that reshape the course of history. But the transition between those systems can be turbulent, to say the least. The individuals and the communities that navigate such transitions most successfully are rarely those who cling most tightly to the institutions of the past. Rather, they are those who learn how to observe emerging patterns and adapt to new realities as they unfold. So the wilderness, in this sense, is not only a time of danger, it's also a time of possibility. It is not the possibility of stabilizing a collapsing system. No, the system is collapsing, it's going. It's the possibility of allowing the structures of the past to fall so that something new can replace them. So at this moment of history on this planet, we are not trying to preserve a current corrupt regime. We are simply watching that corrupt regime crumble due to its own internal energies. We are not causing the crash, we are watching it. We do not really enter the equation until after the crash, when there will be a critical moment when humanity needs to reflect not on where it has been, since everyone will then see clearly the corruption of the past and the influence of, for example, very negative extraterrestrials in shaping that past. Rather, we are arriving at the moment when humanity will need to reflect on where it wants to go, the direction of the future trajectory. We have not yet arrived at that moment because the crash has not yet been complete. But we will soon get to that moment, and that is what Farsight is all about. The moment when this planetary civilization pivots. So at this point, I would like to relate a story that was told by Orion Taraban. Now, he's a popular YouTube psychologist who often focuses on relationship issues between men and women, and I like to watch these relationship videos. I think they're very informative, and I like to look at the relationship discussions and project them out to worldwide events. So this Orion Taraban, in his own practice, he found that successful men do not use dating apps. In fact, he seemed to suggest that only losers use dating apps. The reasoning is that the dating apps take lots of time, like hours and hours of swiping left and swiping right. And then a person needs to make a date to go meet a woman, typically involving a long drive, only to meet the woman and have a drink, and then to set up another date if they like one another, say for dinner. Now, successful men, lawyers and executives, they often earn $1,500 to $5,000 an hour professionally. So if you add up all the time used with the dating app, swiping left and right, and the time used to drive out to meet the woman, have a drink, and then to drive back, that took a lot of hours, and 10 hours total would not be unheard of at all. Well, if you make $5,000 an hour professionally, that drink that you had with the woman, that drink interaction costs a successful man $50,000. Now, the result is that the only people who regularly use dating apps are people who are not successful professionally, people who do not earn much per hour. Successful people cannot afford to use the dating apps. It is not an efficient use of their time. Successful people find other ways to interact personally with people, ways that do not involve the structure of social media. So why is this relevant to our current discussion? Successful people create their own structure. They interact with real people and have real interactions. They do not let the structure of the environment that is made by someone else that writes the dating app limit what they do. Think of the dating app as the constricting organization that society offers to the masses. And the masses typically follow that psychological guidance, hypnotically following the structure. Well, the masses, led by social media, thus become enslaved in real terms. Their minds are captured, and they no longer create their own destiny. They fall into the destiny that's created by the social media. They no longer forge their own unique path in life until the surrounding structure collapses, and then they have no choice but to sort out their new reality. They have entered the wilderness. So in our example, they may uninstall the dating app because they can see it as enslaving power more clearly. Or they can see its enslaving power more clearly. And after the collapse, they can see that. After the collapse, for a brief period of time, they are finally free to pivot and maybe delete the dating app. So let's return to the wilderness thing. The wilderness around me right now, I'm in my camper in the wilderness, is quiet. The ocean moves steadily against the shore. Wind moves through the grasses that grow among the ruins that are scattered along the coastline. The structures that remain here were built by earlier generations who believed that they were constructing something permanent. Now they stand as reminders that every system eventually reaches its limit of its stability, and the energy that they built into these structures decays, and that energy is released back into the wilderness. So civilizations do not collapse because people wish them to collapse. They collapse because the underlying structures that support them eventually become unsustainable. And when that point is reached, history does not politely slow down. It accelerates. And from the perspective of nature, these transitions are not unusual. The natural world is full of cycles, growth, expansion, decline, and renewal. Human civilizations are not exempt from those cycles simply because they have developed sophisticated technologies or complex political systems. The ruins scattered along this coastline are reminders of that fact. Every generation believes that its systems will last indefinitely, but history repeatedly demonstrates otherwise. So the wilderness is no longer a metaphor. For most of the last several decades, discussions about civilization collapse have been treated as theoretical. Writers of science fiction imagined possible futures. Historians studied the rise and fall of earlier empires. Analysts debated whether modern technological societies might face similar pressures someday. And that period of speculation is ending. The structural periods, the structural pressures described earlier, such as political fragmentation, information warfare, institutional decay, accelerating technological change, and intensifying global conflict, those are no longer abstract possibilities. They are already unfolding. The wilderness is no longer approaching, it has begun. And once such transitions begin, they rarely reverse themselves. Complex systems that reach the limits of their stability tend to reorganize rather than return to the earlier forms. And that is why the world described in Snow Crash could not be viewed merely as an imaginative exercise. It should be viewed as a recognizable piece of trajectory. A fragmented world, a weakening of centralized authority, competing networks of power, information systems battling for control of human perception. These are not distant possibilities. They are structural direction. And they are the structural direction in which our civilization is now moving. So let's connect this with remote viewing. What have we been seeing with the remote viewing? For many years, research conducted at Farsight has explored possible future trajectories for human civilization, witnessed personally. And we have explored hot points on the globe, all the places that you now see fighting with wars. We have penetrated the deepest secrets of humankind, and you can see all of our stuff on farsightprime.com. And we did it all while showing you exactly how we obtained our data, always using blind, scientifically sound methodologies, and always getting corroborating data from multiple viewers working independently. We never, ever push what others tell us, or you. We base everything on our own raw data, and we offer all of our data in the form of exact transcripts for the world to analyze, as well as videos, of course, and to reanalyze. So we are not basing our conclusions on only one remote viewing session or project. We are talking about hundreds of sessions and hundreds of projects. Through numerous remote viewing projects and deep news sessions, a consistent picture has emerged. The modern global order is entering a period of profound transformation. The political and institutional structures that define the 20th century are not stable enough to survive the pressures now building within the system. And the transition will not occur in a single dramatic moment, but it will not take years either. Now is the moment of escalation. The transition will unfold through a series of escalating crises that have already begun. You can see them around the world. People are openly talking about us having just entered the development of World War III. Geopolitical conflicts, economic disruptions, technological upheavals, and struggles over the control of information and perception. Those processes are now underway, and you can see them. The trouble is, most people refuse to accept where these crises are heading, and that is where humanity needs help. So what once appeared to be distant possibilities are rapidly becoming present realities. The wilderness is opening around us now in real time. So why information matters now is because during wilderness periods, the most valuable resource is not territory or wealth, it's accurate information about what is actually happening. So when institutional systems begin to fail, large populations often struggle to understand the forces that are reshaping their world. The narratives become confused, the media environments become chaotic, competing actors attempt to shape perception in ways that serve their interests. And under these conditions, access to clear analysis becomes extremely important. Understanding these structural forces driving global events can allow individuals and communities to prepare psychologically and intellectually for the transformations that are already underway. A resource, let's talk about a resource for the wilderness. For that reason, the work presented at Farsight and distributed through farsightprime.com should not be viewed as simply a form of entertainment. It is intended as a resource. The projects, analyses, and discussions available there are designed to help people understand the deeper forces shaping our historical moment. They explore questions that many mainstream institutions are either unwilling or unable to address openly. As the wilderness expands, access to such knowledge becomes increasingly valuable, because the greatest challenge during periods of civilization transition is not merely surviving the external changes, it's understanding what those changes mean. So we are entering the wilderness. Humanity is now crossing a threshold. The stability that defined the previous era is fading. The structures that organize global civilization for generations are entering a period of irreversible transformation. We are stepping into a new historical landscape, a wilderness. And the time for pretending that this transition is hypothetical has passed. The wilderness is here, now. So to make this more concrete, to understand the deeper meaning of the wilderness, let me explain what we will be doing this week. So here I am physically in the wilderness, in my camper, and that physicality is designed to help you transition your own thinking so that you can accept the reality of our planetary condition. But remember that there is beauty and peace in the wilderness also. And when the prison structures of the past collapse, that is the moment when you should turn your attention away from those confining boundaries and look at that which is different. The peace and beauty that has always been in front of you, but which you ignored because of the dominance of the prison's information control systems. So let me be very clear about what I mean. I am talking about two specific things. I am talking about the information that Farsight brings to your front door, and I am talking about the good ETs, the good extraterrestrials, who have long been trying to construct a path that will lead you to waking up and seeing them. Disclosure is not about discovering that the UAPs are real or that we are not alone in the universe. Those who dwell on those questions are still in the grips of the controlling powers' psychological madness. Disclosure is about seeing who your oppressors really are. Not just now, but historically, going back thousands of years. Your true oppressors have controlled you from hidden realms. Their power over you is structured by them hiding their true selves, and by tricking you into believing their own crazy narratives, your gods, your myths, your hypnotic allegiance to those who lead you with fear and inspire you with hatred towards other groups, nations, and peoples. Once you see your oppressors for who they really are, only then can you see past their oppression and recognize the wilderness for what it truly is. The wilderness is not a place. It is a state of recognition. It is cognition. And it is understanding. And in this moment in time, it is absolutely impossible to see it without true information that you can believe being made available to you. And it must be believable because you have seen how it has been collected and assembled. Farsight and FarsightPrime.com are not alternative narratives that compete for your attention. Find any other source of information that gives you raw data, real information, unfiltered with total openness over the data collection process. Any other source that is similar to what Farsight offers you. Search as long as you want, but you will not find it. Farsight is unique. Farsight is essential. Farsight is not a luxury. Farsight is what you need in order for you to pivot away from the enslavement of the past, to walk out of the prison that has bound you for all too long. So don't compare Farsight to venues who tell you things to believe, but who do not show you how they got their information and under what conditions. So do not believe dished up narratives that seek to lead you over the cliff like the Pied Piper of Hamelin. Now is the moment when you need to see the truth and to recognize the truth as truth. Now is not the time when you need to put your faith in people who want to lead you. Now is the time when you need to pivot and to see the wilderness and compared with where you have been these thousands of years, the wilderness can be both frightening and beautiful. If you resist it, it is frightening. If you embrace it, you realize its beauty and its power. Only something powerful can destroy the structures that have enslaved you for centuries on this planet, for centuries on end. But ending that enslavement can lead you to real freedom. So, friends, here I am in the wilderness, literally. But the wilderness is not coming someday. Humanity has already stepped into it. The only question now is whether we will understand what is happening while there is still time to choose what comes next. Finally, let me explain what we will be doing this week. Importantly, I will be hosting live streams all week. I invite you to join me. This week I will be showing you how to record video of real ET spacecraft, the spacecraft that the bad ETs want to keep hidden from you, but we will show you how to see them live on demand. So stay with me this week. You're going to see a lot. And be sure that you are subscribed to our YouTube channel so that you can be sure to see the live streams. And be sure to hit the notifications bell that appears after you subscribe so that YouTube will notify you of when we begin each session in the wilderness. And after we record during a live stream, we will edit the footage and then publish the results of those recording sessions on FarsightPrime.com. So you see, after recording the videos of these ships, we need to process them, slowing them down so that you can see the fast-moving spacecraft and applying special filters that circumvent their stealth tech. So you will need to watch the live streams to see how we record the spacecraft, and then you will need to watch the finished video to actually see what we recorded. So it's a two-step process. The live streams are on YouTube, and the finished videos will be on FarsightPrime.com, where you will see the actual spacecrafts. And of course, in addition to the spacecrafts, we will be meeting with our friends, and your friends also, the good ETs. So you will want to see those interactions as they take place, unscripted and fun. Stick with us this week. It is unprecedented, brought to you live from Farsight. So keep watching. Friends, we had a good turnout today, and I thank you so much for sticking with us, and especially with the technological issues that we had. This is the first time I've ever used my our Starlink terminal, so it looks like we finally got it to work. There was a little buffering, but generally speaking, it worked. I want to thank you so much for doing that. So we don't know exactly when we're going to be doing the live streams this week because we have to look at the weather. We don't want to be stuck out in the rain and things, but the weather at the beach is usually pretty good. So that's why you have to hit that notifications bell, because when we see it looks like it's good, we're going to be setting up our stuff and doing it, and then we're going to be turning on the live streams. Then that's when YouTube will notify you. So make sure you click on that notifications bell. All right, everybody, I want to thank you so much. I am going to be editing this spotlight and uploading it as a permanent video, both on YouTube and farsightprime.com. And all the glitches will take out all the glitches. All right, so be sure to watch the finished version when you get it. All right, everybody, I want to thank you so much for being here. And this was fun. This was actually a lot of fun. Okay, and I'll see you next Sunday also for the next spotlight. But that's going to be done in our studio. The live streams will be happening this week using the same type of setup, the same type of equipment, but we'll be outside. We'll be at the beach. We'll be doing things. When we record the videos of the UAPs, of the spacecraft, we're outside in the middle of the day. So that's going to be happening this week. But I'm going to be back in the studio next weekend. So the next spotlight will be in the studio at the normal time, 7 o'clock. We were a little late starting today, but I hope you can understand. There was a time change. Daylight savings time happened, and then also had to get to the camper, set up the camper, and get all the equipment out. And we had never actually done this with the live stream in a location like this in the camper, so there was a lot of stuff we had to do in it, so it delayed the live stream. But next Sunday it'll be in the studio, normal time, 7 o'clock Eastern, which I think is around midnight UTC time, okay? But 7 o'clock Eastern US time. All right, everybody, love you all, and I will be seeing you in a week. And thanks so much for hanging in there with me today. See you later, okay?